Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hidden Conversations. I am joined this morning by one of our members, Ros Young, and we're going to be discussing transitions and why in the therapeutic community, when we are so focused on the transitions for our clients, we very rarely talk about the lessons that we've learned from our own transitions. So Ros, good morning.
Morning.
How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yes.
Good. I know that as 2020 is coming to a close, everyone is conscious of the transitions that have been taking place. Not just COVID, we've seen mass unrest and disruption, but we've also seen transitions taking place as a result of all of those things. What do you think, as you, has been the biggest transition from 2020?
The biggest one, gosh, it's almost a conglomeration of so many, really. So trying to pick out the biggest one, proving a bit elusive, but maybe that is the transition. Maybe that's part of it, is the discovery and finding out that the level of flexibility that maybe I had perceived as being available in other people, I actually have that as well. So I think it's the transition from the expected as it used to be, in terms of seeing people face to face and maybe on the phone if they're a great distance away, but involving rather more technology and noticing that the transition that can be made in that geographical sense and the introduction of technology. So that's perhaps for me as a part of the transition of 2020. Yes.
Yeah, I think there has been a mass transition in the sense of the way professionals are working. And that conglomerate of multiple transitions all at the same time is in itself a transition, because it's not been connected like this before.
It's almost been seen as a bit of a niche. You know, people who offer therapy and previously did offer therapy using online systems. It was out there as something that other people did, and maybe also with that hint of, if you want to offer that, you have to go and get a training in it, so that you can work productively in that arena. But I think maybe that sense perhaps has been debunked in the necessity of it, you know, in finding out you don't have to go and do a specific training because you can use this format anyway.
And the urgency of the transition as well, I think, is something very, very new to so many people, because all of the transitions within the therapeutic processing, whether that's coaching, counseling, psychotherapy, has all been relatively evolutionary. And that kind of slide along into these new processes, whereas 2020 has kind of come along as a bit of a cliff edge and gone, you want to carry on, time to change.
Yeah.
And have you found it comfortable to make such quick changes?
Initially, no. I wasn't terribly comfortable, and I think in that discomfort I was quite resistive for a short space of time, because then maybe because of how I operate and maybe the circles of inquiry I find myself in, the question was very much, what am I resisting? What is it necessary to resist? Why not try it? Do the experiment and try it. If it works, brilliant. If it doesn't work, you've got useful information to take forward. So it was almost putting myself in the position of sitting in the client chair and asking the question of me that I might ask of the client. So yeah.
And that's the key to really good transitional working anyway, isn't it? Is that forever asking yourself what you would be asking of the client.
Yeah. Not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, and in that, avoiding any kind of sense of, am I being a hypocrite? Am I asking people to do things that I'm not prepared to do myself?
Yeah. Do you think that your experience prior to 2020 made that ability to question yourself easier, or do you think the fact of 2020 being what it was and having to ask that question is kind of more dominant?
I think prior experience was very much in there. I think the experience of upping and moving home quite a bit, of maybe doing things when others have been questioning, or maybe, shall we say, less than supportive, and carrying on anyway, and joining the military and going into an entirely different culture, and then leaving the military and coming back to what is not a military culture at all. Those levels of transition and where one places oneself in the group of humanity, I think doing those things has enabled me to be okay with asking that question. So I think for me it was interesting that the level of internal resistance. So
And that kind of brings me to that question of why the resistance, because the resilience to transition is there.
Mhm.
The comfortability that transition is manageable is there, but when the moment of transition comes, there is still a knee-jerk, almost innate, no, I don't want to go there. What do you think caused that?
It almost felt like an ordinary human thing, where we're not sure, where maybe the excitement for the opportunity is very much to the fore. I think there can be space for that. Oh, that deep intake of breath, and okay, here we go. This is it. Almost the moment of no return. That sense was there. Maybe this year highlighted by the overwhelming sense of, that there's just no return from this that anybody can see at the moment, and questions keep being asked in various places of, what's the exit strategy, what's going to happen. Nobody seems to know. So
an exit strategy?
I know, what's that?
Really?
Of course, yeah, because we've had Brexit and good, all these people.
I'm just hearing from our lawyers. Apparently, we can't ask for one.
But I think for me it was the allowing of that normalcy, that normality of just being aware of the human reaction to change when it's of such a fundamental level.
Yeah, every superhero has to take the cape off at some point and be human. And I think 2020 has really highlighted that as superheroes in the room, and I very much mean that, the work that is done in the therapeutic room is that of a superhero. But 2020 has been paralleled in so many ways with the client work. And that's meant that cape has really had to come off, because we know that we're in the same storm as the clients are.
Yeah, and
we're not in the same boat. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to, but it's definitely the same storm. And while we may have navigational tools to support client, and if we can kind of hold on to those, work with ourselves, but we're still in that storm. And it's okay not to be okay when you're in a storm.
Yeah, I'm certainly not okay in storms, and I'm thinking literally on a boat in a storm. I'm absolutely not okay. But knowing that there are things that can be put in place to mitigate, but I'm not convinced that we've even had time to mitigate against a lot of this. I mean, at this present moment, we're in lockdown version 2, so maybe in some respects we have had warning, and we have been able to in place some things to lessen the blow, shall we say, but there's still so many questions that transition is it's not a smooth thing anyway, but this one is a heck of a bumpy ride.
Yeah. And when I started this, I pointed out that I wanted to really look at the lessons from transition, but also why is it that professionals, when they go through transition, we are all comfortable at accepting we've been through transitions. We very rarely share our lessons to support each other when it comes to transition. We'll share experiences about modalities. We'll share experiences about different genres within and different client presentations. But transition is something that's so very personal. It's almost like it's the one bit that we kind of go, no, I don't want to share that. And I wonder whether there's a reason behind that.
I wonder if it might be held in some respects in the format of the learning as it's presented, that maybe there are training platforms there that don't look at that don't have opportunity for that, or are simply set up that that's somehow not a thing that's even included. I mean, maybe I've been incredibly lucky that the trainings I've been on have been very securely held, so that it almost turned into not a support group, you know, what's in the room stays in the room, that sort of thing, but it was what was in the room stayed in the room. And so there was a level of cooperation and interpersonal respect between all of the attendees and the tutors, that allowed for transitions to be okay, to be voiced and aired and explored. So but it's absolutely take what you say, that it generally isn't. If you go to maybe a group supervision, it tends to be about the process, about the client clinician process. What's that? And maybe ideas given on to, you know, what about that? Did you notice this? Or you know, kind of ideas around that. But very rarely is it, well, where were you in that? What you know, what did that speak to you about? What was your movement forward? Yeah. Is this something that perhaps we take to supervision? I mean, I don't know. And again, does that depend on the supervisor?
And I think for me as a coach, understanding the power of that shared learning that comes from that very thing that you just pointed out. Where were you in this journey? What was your experience? How did you feel as that you were transitioning? When we share that, the power of that learning just amplifies our entire awareness of whatever the process is that we're kind of facing, really. And I think, you know, you've been through the military experience, you've been through National Health Service transitions and restructurings.
Oh man.
Let's reinvent the wheel, because the wheel is obviously not round enough.
It was wearing.
So when you look at the transitions that you've been through and the lessons that you come away from each of those, is there a kind of overall lesson that you think you've come away with, without going into details of some of those transitions? Because, you know, I don't want to open up, you know, examples of this transition or that transition, but in general.
I think in general, perhaps noticing the journey as it is, and those moments of transition as particular transitions, because maybe we're transitioning all of the time. We're moving in our psyche all of the time, and each conversation we have moves us further in one direction or another, or reinforces where we're at. But in terms of kind of the big transitions that maybe we look back on and go, oh, oh, okay. Maybe it was that the things that I entered into were necessary at the time. They fulfilled a need, and not in terms of, you know, just pay me enough money to pay the mortgage, or, you know, not the basic kind of gross needs of living, but the personal ways of how do I feel like I have some level of value in this world, and how can that value be not necessarily recognized and trumpeted, but maybe seen enough that I feel okay within that space. And I think so, working within the NHS, that had a value, and that fulfilled that need for a while, until the overwhelming impossibility of running a ward with 5 urgent cases and only 3 staff, so the numbers didn't even add up, and yet it was my registration at risk. That then overwhelmed the value that it gave to me and my presence there. And I think overall, as a major transition, perhaps is into the value that I do have, and that I don't have to enter or remain in a space where there is detriment to me. And kind of noticing where that detriment comes from, and not just accepting it's part of the job, because maybe I don't accept that anymore.
Yeah. And that kind of gives you a really solid foundation on the boundaries that you are then able to build, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think, like you say, within the training arena, you can have transitions explored, you can have the discussions, but once that piece of paper's been signed by a qualifying council, you know, that certificate arrives, do we, as professionals, do we walk away from some of those building blocks, do you think?
I think there can be opportunity for that to happen. And I think for me, this is perhaps where having good connections and good, solid and trusting support with a supervisor who knows what you're at and where you've been through, because that level of supervision for me has been incredibly useful in reminding of those transitions, of where I used to be, as using me as an example, where I used to be compared to where I am now. Because maybe it's in our human nature to forget where we used to be, and in the forgetting we then don't notice the progress we've made, or even any of the transitions necessarily. Yeah, the differences get forgotten. It's like having a cold, isn't it? You've got a cold, it's the worst cold in the world, but the next cold you get, it might, you know, we're saying it's the worst cold in the world, but it might not be, but we've forgotten where we were.
Yeah, it's a good analogy on the back of COVID.
Felt kind of relevant. Yeah.
No, yeah, this is just
and flu.
just to put the record straight. Colds are a collective of different kinds of coronaviruses, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, they
Why
are.
there isn't a cure, because it just keeps changing. What it does.
Exactly, that's what viruses do, and I'm drawing on my nursing knowledge on that one. Yeah.
100 years of research into coronaviruses. We have Lemsip, and we have a flu vaccine. That's not a vaccine.
It's not.
Enough of COVID.
Yes, sniffles. Yes.
Moving on. Some of the big transitions that you've been through, and I'm kind of want to kind of pick up on the home moves and the frequency of home moves through military service. Do you think that's a transition that for a lot of professionals who work with ex-military that isn't really understood and acknowledged?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I think to be more certain in that, I would. I mean, it'd be interesting to have the conversation with colleagues. But perhaps this is the opportunity. I think unless it's one of those life experiences where we can perhaps intellectually understand that on that famous list of stresses of life, divorce, death, moving house, job, all of that list, that moving house is accepted as a great stressor. But if you're in the military and you know that your roots are necessarily needing to be very shallow in that geographical space, then how do you find yourself feeling solid, feeling grounded? Because I don't think that military do. There perhaps is an inherent need to not be anchored to one place, or just a more resigned acceptance that if you want to, fly jet planes, then you're going to be moved around the world. But it is a huge stress, and it's always looming because you never really know when that posting notice is going to come through. And then suddenly you've got to pack up your life. And certainly in the Air Force, you tended not to be moved around in great squadrons. You kind of got posted somewhere, maybe by yourself or with a couple of others. Then suddenly you've got to meet new people, which isn't necessarily a problem for me, but it does add into that. You're moving countries, maybe you're moving areas, you're meeting new people. You don't even know where the gate guard is. You're absolutely topsy-turvy. You don't know where you're at. And then you're straight into the job when you get there. You don't have time really to kind of land and get to grips with it.
Touch base, work out the cultural, even sometimes the local legal arenas in which you are now working. And I think, having spoken to ex-service personnel, and I say that with all heartfelt thanks and gratitude for what they've done. The experience that they relay in conversations with me, where they've been through therapeutic support, is civilian therapeutic professionals, because ultimately there are no longer any military therapeutic professionals out there within the military. They are all, outside of service. The understanding of, yes, they've been through military experience, that's accepted. Yes, professionals get that. There is the disassociation within family. Yes, professionals get that. The one thing that comes back over and over again is the impact of that constant anticipation of moving. Is the one bit that a lot of ex-service personnel say a civilian therapeutic professional really struggles to understand what that is like.
Yeah, I think that's very true. That is very true. I mean, for want of simplification, and it's certainly not, I'm not meaning to diminish anybody's experience whatsoever, military, civilian, doesn't matter, but it's almost a sense of, if a civilian thinks of transition, of change, of moving, they may do that once or twice, possibly, and they do it meaningfully, and they're involved in the process, and they look around at houses and they choose where they want to go. Maybe that's why we get estate agent packs, isn't it, telling us where the nearest train station is and the local schools and all the rest of it. We have that opportunity to go and look around and make that choice. But military, you get that letter in your inbox at the unit, and it's okay, we're off to Wales, or we're off to the Outer Hebrides, and you have no say. There is no choice about that, and if choice is tried to be exercised, it's a big problem. That cannot be. So you literally have signed away your life, and you get sent wherever. You have no choice, and that's the fundamental thing. That's the massive trade-off, is that you never really live anywhere.
Do you think that creates the conflict for the therapeutic professional when they're working in that environment? Because the individual has made that choice, the impact of that is never understood when you make the choice. Nobody really gets that in managing and coping with that choice and how that is delivered and played out, it has an adverse impact on everything around you, not just you. You know, you make that choice at 17, 18, 19, in the UK up till 34. But the impact of it is you can't go back on once you understand the impact.
Yeah.
And that creates a conflict for the therapeutic professional. Well, this was the choice you made. Surely you know what I mean? It's
big, and yet there perhaps is the logic for me that how can anybody possibly understand that level of disconnect in terms of being in group, accepted with others, in place, knowing where you are. How can you possibly understand that disconnect unless you've come out of the looked after arena, where maybe you've been moved from foster home to care home, and yet that seems to be an understood level of potential harm and disconnection within people. But for the military, there's this judgment of like, well, you signed on the dotted line, then you put up with it. But unless you've been through the care arena, you won't understand what
the
it
context
means.
of what that means. Yeah,
Yeah,
and that brings me to the next kind of point in understanding transitions for therapeutic professionals. Like you say, if we're working with somebody who's been through the care experience, we understand that that's going to be transitions, that's going to be placement moves, it's going to be all of the things that we know and understand, and we can work with that. Mm-hmm. When we're working with the military and their transition, we almost go, let's say, well, you signed up for it. Yet the impacts are mirrored. Mm-hmm. Who's making the judgment as the therapeutic professional that there is a difference in the impact because somebody was brought up in that because that's what life threw at them, and somebody made a decision at 17 that was the life that they were going to go into?
Yeah, I think in neither of those situations is there informed choice. There can't be, because until you're in it and have experienced it and know the full sense and impact of it, I would offer you don't know it. You can intellectually know it in your head, but you don't necessarily feel it.
It's the emotive connection to the impact, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the foresight to know that there is going to be that emotional impact.
Yeah.
And the extent of that impact, because I'm going to move. I'm going to be going. It's like the recruitment ads used to say. Join up and see the world.
See the world
every 6 months.
Yeah, very well. You kind of almost feel like you're living out of a suitcase. Your life is just this big. It cannot be any bigger because you can't carry it around with you. So.
Yeah, and this is where I think as professionals, understanding the impact of transition, certainly in those care experience lives and the military experience lives, it's so important that the therapeutic professional understands and is able to step back from that judgment about the impact.
Yeah, and to see the commonality, to see that in terms of the looked after children and youths, they had no informed choice about that. It was what it was for them, and that ran like that. And for military personnel, signing on the dotted line, again, informed choice, possibly, but not until they have been through it do they really know it. And of course, there's also the kind of the thoughts that I find I go towards those that have signed up to the military, who have been through the looked after system, and so for them it's just a repeat of what they know anyway. They don't ever kind of get that grounding, that solidity, that belonging, and so when they transition out of the military, it can be one of the most traumatic experiences of their lives, because suddenly it's all changed. They're not being told where to go, what uniform to wear, where where you're going to eat. Suddenly they're on their own, and maybe they were not on their own before because they were looked after and moved around a lot potentially, and that continued for them in their efforts maybe to join this big family called the Forces.
Yeah. And it's one of the things that when APA puts the BITIMO program out for ex-forces, we are very, very mindful that there are going to be individuals that have already been through the care experience. And that understanding, that desire to be part of the bigger team, the bigger family, that stability, that structure is what a child in that situation is desperate to secure. And when that's all taken away, they've got no independence living skills, very little decision-making skills or independent living. They have a very reactive personality because that is what the military required, and it's reactive without question.
Yep.
That is key. You can be reactive and not have a problem, but when you are reactive without question, because you've got the team around you, you are doing what the job is that you are required to do. Well, if you're in a nightclub and you see someone that's doing something that they shouldn't be to somebody else, and your defense mechanism kicks in, and you've got reaction without question, the chances are you could be doing 6 to 12 years for defending somebody else because of that experience that you've had. And that is something that we see in the justice sector.
Certainly, yes. I saw it when I worked in the prison service. Yeah, the amount of people who somehow or somewhere down the line hadn't had the opportunities in their growing up times to practice those skills of evaluating before action. It's just, and there they are again in another situation where they're told what to do, when to get up, where to be,
and the familiarity has re-emerged itself, and it's like, okay, so this is now the family where I can be, and I can be here for the rest of my life. I just have to keep making sure I get brought here. And we have that repeat, so we're not breaking the cycle of reaction over of response over reaction. And I think the ability to understand transitions for therapeutic professionals, certainly against the backdrop of all three, the care sausage machine, the military sausage machine, and the justice sausage machine, is so vital that a really good therapeutic professional can see those sausage machines for what they are and not place the transitions part or the responsibility for the transitions part on the profession, to the individual, but allow them as a professional to go, let's have you work through the transition part all on its own. And do you think that the overall training for professionals to work with those desired group or those targeted groups, justice, ex-military and care leavers, is something that should be a focus for the profession? Or do you think it highlights that there is a difference in those individuals?
That's an interesting question. I'm reluctant to kind of single out and almost perhaps unconsciously invite any level of prejudice or otherness. I think that once there's an awareness of the fundamental processes that are going on for people who have had those experiences, and perhaps haven't had the opportunity to practice transition, I think that a qualified, experienced professional can help people to practice transition, to notice what transition is and where it has been in their lives and when it's worked. So I'm reluctant to kind of specialise it off, and yet maybe perhaps at this present time that there might be some mileage in having people to focus on those, so that perhaps that can be started, and then maybe that can be then promulgated out among all professionals.
And for me, as someone who pretty much all of my life has been around military, I think as soon as we get into a situation of we can only go and speak to this professional because they've done this training, we run the risk of isolating even further. Not just the professional, but also the person in need.
Yeah, and perhaps automatically and by default bottlenecking people. If there's only 5 or 6 professionals who say I deal with care leavers or I deal with military transitions, then suddenly that it almost by default dismisses all other professionals who could very well be absolutely perfect and focusing on the importance of transition and change management for people.
For me, to put it on the record, personally, I would like to see additional consciousness put into the level 4 training on transitions for those that have not had those building blocks. That's it. Once that awareness is in, not everyone has those building blocks. And if someone has been through that journey, and we see it more and more in the last decade, care leaver to military to justice, it's almost become a path of life for so many. In 2018, the Home Office declared that 40% of under 21s that were incarcerated had been in the care system. That's a sausage machine to sausage machine straight there. We also know that by previous profession, the largest number of incarcerated adults are ex-military. Now that says that the transition from the military to Civvy Street isn't as effective as it could be.
It could be better.
Could be a lot better, a lot quicker, a lot smoother, and a lot more relevant to the experience that they've been through. CV writing on the 1-day course that someone goes through if they have served one contract in the military is not going to be enough to avoid the experiences that we are currently seeing come out from that. And it's almost as though the military has, and I don't want to beat the military up on this, and it's only about raising awareness of how the process works. Okay? If you work one contract, that's 4 years, you can be in your early 20s when you leave the military with no life experience outside of whatever you had through schooling, through college, into the military, if you put that college stop break in. You will get 1 day of civilian preparation. Invariably, that is how to write your CV, and these are the employers that you can go to. You've got no other experience other than what you've just been through.
Yeah.
Invariably, if you have done one contract, you will have seen at least one tour of active frontline service or frontline field of operations. Unfortunately, that is the scary fact for the majority of our military.
Yeah.
However, only 2 8% of what comes out of the military report experiencing psychological difficulties.
Mm.
The perception is wrong on this transition. The therapeutic community, please get the right context of what it is that the situation is coming out from them for service personnel.
Yeah. And even if you've done longer tours, you've served longer years, the resettlement that's offered, it not knocking it, very useful to perhaps be given a funded course in electrical repairs and house rewirings. That just as an example, very useful, because you'll need the civilian certificate so that you can go and do this job.
Yeah.
But
I found that with my PTI certificate.
it doesn't address the transition between being just one tiny little cog in a massive machine that directs you where to go, who to speak to, how you speak to them, what you wear, into suddenly you're in charge of yourself. And if you've been there for enough years to get that paid for course for civilian employment, it is possible that the entrenchment into the way of military, even the language that's used, it doesn't translate automatically into a smooth move into civilian life.
And that's where Bitimo really comes into its own. Bitimo, for those that aren't aware, is APA's program that supports the ex-military community. It's the only program under NATO's remit that brings the service personnel, a person of significance, into the same learning arena. So you have an automatic support system, and you're focusing on core skills for resilience and for civilian interaction. The programs that Ros just mentioned, the resettlement packages, are a paid set of courses that allow people to go off and do vocational learning in order to carry out self-employment or paid employment for somebody else. Electrical engineering, bricklaying, blacksmith, barrier, all of those, all in the mix. Fabulous and very much appreciated. What Bitimo does is say, you can be the best bricklayer in the world. You can learn every technique and be a master craftsman. But if you cannot speak to a client in a way that that client expects and appreciates and engages with, you will not be working for very long. And that's the key. We can give people the skills, but if we cannot get the responsive personality back into the fore, people are always going to struggle. And I think for you, Ros, you went into the military after life experience.
Yeah.
Do you think that made a difference for you?
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. I think it was a case of I'd already been around the block a few times, so so the question was I actually physically going to be able to manage it? Because once you get into your late 20s and 30s, then there is a very real risk that you won't be able to put a 40-pound backpack on and run around in a field looking like an overgrown sprout. So, but
baby cabbage, not sprout. Don't do sprout.
I like sprouts. I like sprouts. Anyway, but see, this is my take. This is how I viewed it. That I approached that knowing that there was a possibility there, and yes, I'll say, big old Bergen and running around like a sprout. For some kind of diehard military, that's disrespectful. But for me, that's an outside view, bringing my take to it, and not just accepting what is given as being the one and only truth. And I think the difference that I noticed was very much that the questions I had surprised people in the military. They just,
Sometimes.
yeah, it wasn't what they were expecting. And yet there were other opinions who said, well, what did they expect? You know, they brought you in and already qualified because they wanted your skills to run the unit. So what did they expect? That you would, you know, not bring yourself in?
No, the operational military don't have expectations. We have, this is the way it is, and
Yeah,
this is the way it's done.
yeah.
Nothing in here. No, there's nothing here for any of us. Our
No.
job is to do or die, and we do it this way, and we
Yeah,
die that way.
yeah,
And that is beginning to change.
yeah.
And I, having spoken to personnel serving and recently exited, for want of a better phrase, that is definitely changing, and the perception of the brigadier back at the barracks making a decision, and the poor 17-year-old grunts kind of cannon fodder has long gone from the military, and it's very much more the decision making on the front, and then support system being pulled back into place within the parameters of operational rules and regulations and conventions and everything else. So the military as it is today is made up very differently to what a lot of people's perceptions and a lot of media presentation would have the therapeutic community understand it. Would you say that's fair?
I would actually, because I mean, it's not actually that long ago when we were perhaps all watching It Ain't Half Hot, Mum, and you know,
You horrible little man.
I know, and you know, sort of the satiricals, the comicals, those, but it still had that underlying flavour of you do as you're told, and that's it. You know, and if you don't do as you're told or you chat back, there's consequences. You know, it's not acceptable. Yeah.
Do you think anybody that transitions through institutional systems, put it that way, when they then are in front of a therapeutic professional, do you think there is enough understanding within the therapeutic community that institutionalization that individual has been through has a really deep rooted kind of hold on all of the other presentations? It's not just that in its singularity, if you like. Do you think there's enough of an understanding of that across the community?
No, possibly not, and maybe because our society doesn't require us all to be sent away to boarding school. You know, that there are those who understand boarding school, and there's an understanding that those who've been to boarding school understand the boarding school ethos and what it actually feels like and means, and how it informs our development as we're kind of making our way in the world. And I think any level of institutionalization will always inform how we respond to things, and not necessarily in a conscious awareness fashion. I mean, it certainly there were other examples that I've come across in my time where when I first started psychiatric nursing training, a lot of the out-of-town asylums were still about and still being used as places of residence for people deemed to be incapable or mad. So yes, I've worked in these wonderfully architecturally beautiful places, and people have made their lives there. They maybe had lived there for 20, 30, 40 years, and their life was that ward, that corridor, that bricklaying yard, looking after those cows and that piece of farmland. That was their space. And so when they were closed in a relatively short space of time, I of course moved because there was no job there. They'd shut the place. So I was working in the acute admission arena, to literally find myself standing and watching a person being brought in and going, what are you doing here? The last time I saw you, you lived in that asylum. And they just were not able to transition.
Mm.
They'd had 30, 40 years of living in this life, being institutionalized into this way of being in the world, and suddenly they were in charge of themselves with maybe a CPN once a week if they had
Lucky.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and
And
luck being the operative
and
word.
yeah, and again, this is not bashing anybody or any system. It just was that these people were fundamentally moved out of where they felt they were,
Mm.
and placed in situations where they didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, which way was up sometimes.
Didn't know, and we were seeing them coming into the acute arena because they were not coping and worrying neighbours, whereas if they could have done that to their heart's content in their space, in that asylum, in the true sense of the word, they were having their asylum, their freedom to be,
Their
to
oasis.
absolutely it was, and suddenly the neighbour was not allowing them any oasis at all.
Yeah, and there's there's pros and cons on any kind of residential processing when it comes to mental health, and there's the argument of care in the community has been raging since it was first put up, and I'm not talking about in the 80s under a certain prime minister. Care in the community has been raging since about 1812. And the idea of asylums and residential units and care villages has been around since before Broadmoor had its first bricks laid. Let's not get caught up on this is a new conversation.
No, it's not.
This is something that has gone on for centuries. It's it still hasn't come to any sense of what is best solution, because we're looking for a silver bullet.
And I'm not sure there is one. I think that there's such a myriad of needs at various times in life and according to situation. As perhaps demonstrated with COVID this year, the level of need is growing exponentially, it would seem. So, there's no silver bullet for that.
No. And this is something that I'm glad you kind of brought it back to the COVID backdrop, because not so long ago I saw a post from a young lad who was kind of really, really poignantly pointing out the world has gone into this immediate uncertainty of everything, right? Uncertainty about work, uncertainty about shopping, uncertainty about this, uncertainty about this, and lists all these things, right? And then at the bottom of it, he says, "Welcome to my world of autism."
Oh man, that's powerful.
And we are so out of control of everything that we are out of control of.
Yeah.
And we are struggling as a species. We are struggling to adjust and to transition. And that is the coping arena of autism. And I thought, this young lad has pinpointed exactly why the therapeutic community needs to understand transition, the power of transition, but also the lessons that they have from their own transition so perfectly that we've almost got clouded by our knowledge.
Yeah, we're busy living up here, maybe, rather than allowing the communication between all parts of us, the body part, the soul part, if you will, the psyche, the emotions, the thinking part, all of those that come together and make us who we are. We're going to transition in our own unique ways. There'll be flavors and themes and generalizations, because we're all human beings. But we're not going to be at the same place at the same time, and there won't be a silver bullet.
Yeah, it's as my sensei would have told me when I was about 15. We need to remember the scents on the wind. We all feel the wind, but we don't all get the same scent on the wind.
Yes.
We have to move with the wind. We have to respond to it. Otherwise, it will blow us over. But we can only do what we can do based on the sense that we get on the wind.
Yeah. And laying down and flattening ourselves out to be less prominent is a perfectly viable option.
Yeah. A tree will lay itself down. If it stops it from being blown over, it will go flat. We have to remember that we are connected to the wind just as we are connected to the parts of our own tree.
Yeah, it's the separateness, isn't it? It's the almost enforced separation, which perhaps is where my reluctance comes from, to separate out, you go to that therapist for that, or you go to that person for the other. We have a connectivity based on being human beings, and perhaps it's the underlying necessity that I view of treating each other respectfully, because they're fellow journeyers in this life of human beings.
It comes back to the very principles at which APA stood right at the very beginning, when we decided, okay, what are our building blocks? And we started with 3: empathy, congruence, unconditional positive. And when we can do that, but we can do it for ourselves, when we can have that empathy for ourselves, for our own journey, when we can have congruence about the evolution that we've been through, and we can hold on to the lessons that that journey has given us. And I hate the word journey when it comes to things like this. Yeah. Our evolution. We have evolved. Every single day we evolve.
Yeah.
But everyone we come into contact with has a part to play in that evolution. Positively, negatively, or indifferently. And we might not understand the value of those connections at the point of the connections. And that's okay, because that allows us the unconditional positive regard for what we've been through.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe for practicing therapists, maybe that's highlights, well, it certainly highlights for me the importance of having group support, of having a membership of a transparent group of people, of having a supervisor, or 2 or 3, it doesn't matter, but having supervision that allows for that level of reflection, for reflective practice, for where are we in that process.
Yeah. On the supervision point, just very, very quickly, supervision across the therapeutic community varies, and all of the things that we know about supervision. APA will always ask that you are mindful not to let your supervision become case management or client management. Supervision is there for your growth, for your development, for your understanding. Yes, there will be an element of overwatch on what you are dealing with clients, but do not let that become the predominant part of that relationship. Here endeth the lesson on that. As you know, Ros, all APA members get the starter pack when they join, that has the supervision agreement template in, and a supervision tracker. Do you think that as we go into 2021, the relationship between professional and supervisor needs to be reaffirmed, re-solidified and protected? Or do you think what we're seeing in the sector is fit for purpose, is okay? What are your thoughts?
I think that I mean, certainly my take on supervision, and certainly how I operate as a supervisor, is to almost not go down the specific model route, which I certainly have come across, but to be that place where the evolution and the transition of client and supervisee is enabled to be there present in the room. Obviously, confidentiality and all of those apply. So it's certainly not to do with just case management. How many people are you seeing? What have you done? Why didn't you do that? Did A follow B, or was B after C? That sort of thing. I think it might depend on the format that supervision has been almost aimed at, perhaps by certain membership bodies. What do they accept as supervision? What requirements are there? And I suppose, thinking of that, it may be prudent, and there may be some mileage to revisit it at the start of 21, just to check if it is fit for purpose. If there is, bearing in mind the global mess that we're in, and the level of unknowing that we all have, maybe to revisit that and to just check whether is it still working, because maybe it was working well enough before, but is it working now? It's a good opportunity just to check in, I think.
Yeah. And we haven't mandated the supervisory agreement. We don't want to, or we don't believe we are at that point yet. But we are seeing more and more legal professionals advocating that there should be additional protections between supervisee and supervisor. And that's because the world of litigation against professionals is now opening up because of the world around us. So the protections for the professional is the supervisor, but legally, unless there is an agreement between those, there is no defense for the professional when they are following supervisors' guidance, especially if they are new professionals. And that, I think, is a potential risk for both the client, but also for both the professionals involved in that supervisory relationship.
So yeah, that would be worthy of revisit, perhaps clarification, perhaps rewording if necessary. Yeah.
Okay. Have you got any thoughts around, kind of, for students really, that are maybe in their final kind of year? 2021 is going to be their qualifying time. What would you say to those students about understanding their lessons of transition before qualifying?
Yeah, wow. Do you know, as you were saying that, the first thing that came into my mind was I would be very tempted to say, give yourself some time. Give yourself the credit for having maintained your learnings and gathered your experiences during this monumental time, and give yourself time to settle into your practice. Don't be too harsh on yourself. You've also lived through this monumental upheaval. So yeah, be professional, obviously, but don't be too harsh on yourself.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I certainly agree. I think there's almost an urgency fed into the education arena that once you've qualified, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to. Please, nobody works that way. The brain doesn't work that way. All you do is run faster than your head can keep up. And if anybody's seen somebody that's running down the street like that, it don't look good. And invariably they face plant. And this is what we see, and it's what HMRC says about our profession. We have so many that qualify. We have so many that get into setting themselves up in business that within a year to 5 years are no longer in the business because they've rushed it. Learn the craft. The qualification is what you need. Affiliation will support you as you grow. It's part of the reason why APA has that post-qualified member period, which is a minimum of 12 months, but it can be as long as you need it to be before you're comfortable with going for qualified accredited membership. But you are still accredited based on your capacity, your self-awareness, and your engagement with those that you work with based on your qualifications, your experience, your knowledge. Next month, we are releasing more details about the specializations for professionals. Be recognized for their areas, their niches, their points of focus. Do you think that as 2021 comes, Roz, that specializations and niche working are going to become more important on the back of COVID, or do you think people are just going to want the general, the general access, straightforward knowledge? Let's get support out there. What do you think the public gauges?
I think that there will be a level of need to simply feel supported. And I think maybe from that, there can then be forward movement perhaps towards those who maybe have a focus rather more in an area that may have become more in the conscious awareness through that initial support. But I think they are both equally as important as each other. I wouldn't really want to sort of weight one against the other. I think that
and that's the key, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because of the bottlenecks, we don't have the general access, and because we don't have the general access, we can't activate the specialization.
Yeah, because how can you know? How can you know I need this unless you know and have already sat with your thoughts and your processes for a while to go, oh, that's where I need to put my attention.
Yeah, and this is why the work that is being done to remove those bottlenecks, to highlight the realities on recruitment and selection are being done, and I know that you're working on that in your arena too. What, as we kind of come to a close, what would you like to see professionals understand about transition themselves?
I think professionals' understanding of transition for themselves perhaps is rather more in the allowing it to be part of their experience, to use that reflective time to notice where they have been, because that can surely only help in the work that we do with clients, because maybe we can offer that, or we can understand the sense of what our client is sitting with if we are mindful of the transitions that we have made and allow them to be, to welcome them, to accept them for what they are. I think that's it. I think perhaps just to return to our humanity.
For ourselves, just kind to ourselves, be empathic to ourselves, be congruent about our own journeys, and allow that for us as professionals is key. I think you're spot on. Thank you so much for your time. As you can tell, I am now being called.
Is it dinner time?
the alarm that has rung. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. And if you've got anything from this that you think is of value for your learning, by all means, download the CPD questionnaire, bounce that back to us, and you get that certificate for what's worked for you. Okay, Ros, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. And thank you for everyone that has watched. Please, I look forward to seeing you on another Hidden Conversation. very, very soon. Take care now.